Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation here on my channel. I'm so glad to see everyone who has been waiting patiently for us to begin. I see a few of you in the chat, and I'm thankful for all of you who have slapped that subscribe button or given some of my previous videos a thumbs up. It definitely means a lot. I'm so happy this evening to be reunited with Carrie Janney. It's been a few years since we've spoken, and I'm really happy to have her on to discuss her chapter and the book itself of the Second Manassas Campaign, which I have linked in the chat from UNC Press. Please pick up a copy, if you will, of that. Carrie is the director of the John L. Naw III Center for Civil War History at UVA, and just begun the new semester. I'm sure just going over, the syllabus, Carrie.
Oh, no, we taught yesterday. Yeah.
No, just like chilling and just being like, oh, here's the syllabus.
2 feet in, yeah.
Cracking the whip already. My goodness. That's great. I won't, bug you about that part. I'm sure you're like, I'm ready for this.
Yeah, happy to chat about it if people are interested, but sure.
Maybe if we go into overtime, we'll
Sounds
discuss that one. But I definitely want to talk with you about how this book came about, Carrie. Why the Second Manassas Campaign? Why did you and KT feel like this was the thing to discuss right now?
Right. So this was a series that Gary Gallagher developed that grew out of the conferences that he used to put on every year. I was part of those conferences from, I think 2003 through 2007 or 8. And those conferences were all based around a campaign or a battle. So Chancellorsville, Wilderness, Fredericksburg. And from those conferences, he would take the papers, and people who wanted to then could develop those papers into full-blown essays that would be part of this collection that is part of the military campaigns of the Civil War through UNC Press. It was always intended to cover all of the Eastern Theater. Many eons ago, he had a couple of conferences. I believe he was still at Penn State, perhaps, when he did the conferences on First and Second Bull Run / Manassas. But the books hadn't come out from that set of conferences. So I don't even remember exactly when this was, but the last battlefield tour that we did ended with Appomattox, and there was no campaign book. So I went to him several years ago and said, can we finish these campaign books? And so he and I co-edited one on Petersburg. And then I singly edited one that took us through the Appomattox campaign. And then KT came to me interested in filling in the 2 gaps that we still had in the Eastern Theater, which were First and Second Manassas. And so we jumped on Second Manassas out of chronological order, but because we both had an interest in it and felt like it was such an important battle that, as we talk about in the introduction, gets overlooked because it is stuck right there between the Peninsula Campaign and Antietam. And regardless of what people said at the time about its importance, it was sandwiched between 2 really big campaigns and battles that became even larger in memory, which is something we can talk about. And so we wanted to deal with Second Manassas first.
Were there any challenges to doing this edited volume? Were there things where you were like you wanted to talk about, maybe you didn't get to, or some other things that came up, or was this a pretty smooth sail through the whole thing because you have a great slate of authors in here?
We had a wonderful slate of authors, and we asked some people that in the end, and we were doing this during the pandemic, so it made the challenge was doing the research and getting to places. There were a lot of places that were closed. National Archives, for example, was closed during a big portion of this. I am especially grateful to the park staff at Manassas because they let me come in, and I got to sneak into a back room wearing my mask and hiding out away from everyone else to look through park files. That was the biggest hurdle, I would say, in doing this. And of course, you're limited by the number of pages that you can have. We could have certainly had a book that was twice the size. There are certainly things we don't cover in any depth. We don't talk about Chantilly. We don't really talk about Cedar Mountain. There are other essays, but part of it is who was able to get things done, who was interested in getting things done, and part of the restrictions just on the sheer size that an edited volume can be.
Mhm. I had KT and Gary on earlier this summer, and we discussed both armies basically when we're talking about leadership or lack thereof and logistics or lack thereof. And it's such an interesting story. And we kind of bookended that into the beginning of the Antietam campaign because that's the progression of these events. And we didn't really go over the memory of this particular battle because one, I knew I was going to talk to you, and two, it didn't lend itself to that moment. But I really admired your chapter because I'm a big proponent of the aftermath of battle, the detritus on the battlefield, but also the historical memory associated with that. And so your particular chapter, A National Disgrace, the battle to protect the Bull Run monuments, really appealed to me. And I would love for you to discuss with my listeners why you chose this particular topic.
Well, I'm kind of the memory person, if you will. I keep trying to do something different, and I keep getting pulled back into it. It's my natural instinct, I should say. And I've always been fascinated with the two monuments at Manassas, the one at Henry Hill and the other over at Groveton. Most people aren't even familiar, don't even know that there's one to Second Manassas. And maybe for a point of clarification, I'll pause here and say that as your listeners well know, this is a battle that has two names, and we decided to use Manassas in part because that was the name that the Park Service site has. So rather than using Bull Run, we settled on Manassas, although in the essays, we use Bull Run when we're talking about it from a Union perspective and Manassas from a Confederate perspective. But my interest came about in thinking about these two monuments and knowing that they were erected immediately. I mean, the war, in some ways, not even over in May of 1865. At least there's still lots of questions that haven't been settled. And I had long been curious about who put these monuments up. Why are they in Alexander Gardner's sketchbook? Why is that photograph the closing photograph to his sketchbook? What was said? Who was there? Who were the men that we see and the women that we see in the dedication pictures? And why isn't there more made about them? And why does that battlefield have so few monuments? Of course, there's the large equestrian statue to Jackson that lords over the field, if you will. But these two red sandstone monuments, in many ways, a footnote or long forgotten by many.
And as everyone who's watching realizes when they look down at the title, I use Bull Run because I'm a Yankee, and I had a Union ancestor there at Second Bull Run. So I think they would come back to haunt me if I used Manassas. But the first part of the title says Bull Run. I did give a shout out at the end to Manassas, so I'm skirting both sides here of this thing. But I remember going to the Manassas battlefield the first time when I was young and seeing this monument on Henry House Hill and thinking about its simplicity compared to other places, because I grew up near Gettysburg. So you go to Manassas and here's this simple monument on Henry House Hill that could mean so much to someone. Why this particular spot, Carrie, or why this monument here? What was the reasoning behind the veterans wanting to do this?
Well, there's a great irony to it in some ways, that this is a battlefield, or battlefields rather, where the United States lost not once, but twice. And so I do think it's significant that Union soldiers in the spring, in May of 1865, are saying, we might not have won the battle, but we won the war. And this place in particular is important. Part of it is pragmatism and proximity. the soldiers who ended up the ones who came up with the idea and the soldiers who are physically doing the building, the constructing of these two monuments happen to be soldiers that are stationed. They're part of the 22nd Corps. They are stationed in and around Fairfax Courthouse. They are importantly not part of the Grand Review that happens in late May. And they want to show their respect. They want to show their obligation as they're on these in this kind of quasi-occupying role, but in Fairfax County, in and around Manassas, Fauquier County. They're seeing the remains of their comrades, and they might not have won on that battlefield, but they surely saved the Union and ended slavery, and that they want to commemorate. And so they ask permission to create some sort of simple monument, and they are, as you point out, compared to those that go up in the 1880s at Gettysburg and other places, they're quite simplistic. They're more funerary in their design, which was very much part of the motivation that let's offer some sort of lasting tribute to those men whose remains are still on these fields.
I'm living in Canada now, living in Ontario while I go to school. I've really noticed a lot of the war memorials and the cenotaph and things to the effect that harken back to this particular piece of history, where I'm like, oh, this looks a lot like what I saw at Manassas or at other battlefields where you have this cenotaph kind of looking memorial, and this idea of mourning the dead as compared to glorifying the war itself. Is this part of the that kind of transformation, that early day of transformation, Carrie, where they are still, obviously the war's still going on in some places, or the after effects are still being felt because people are just now getting home? Is this still the mourning phase instead of the phase of reunification or reunion? What is going on here with what's being said or done at this monument?
Right. So it's not reconciliation. And maybe I make a mountain out of a molehill in my book, Remembering, where I distinguish between reunion and reconciliation. But I believe those two things are different. They're often used as synonyms, but reunion is precisely what the Union and what the United States was fighting for the reunion, the reunification of the nation. Reconciliation, meaning both sides at least agree to be silent on the divisive issues and talk and celebrate the honor and bravery of both sides, is something that really, there are bits and pieces of it in the 1870s, but it's the 1880s and 1890s that we see that start to blossom and to come into a more full-throated declaration. These two monuments, dedicated in June of 1865, are simultaneously, as you say, about mourning, but they're also about victory. And they are claiming that space in the name of mourning the loss of those soldiers who gave all.
I've never been to the Groveton Monument, and I'm one of those people that, even though I had an ancestor who probably was wounded nearby, I've never been.
And he was likely buried there initially.
Yeah, and I didn't know that. What is that Groveton Monument as compared to the Henry House Hill Monument? Is it similar in nature? Is there something that makes that one distinctive from the other?
It looks now almost exactly like the one you find at Henry Hill. At the time, it had a few more shells. The soldiers had gone around the battlefield and found shells to decorate, for lack of a better word, the monuments. And where the Henry Hill one had them at each four corners and on the top, the Groveton Monument, they were all the way around. I don't remember. I don't think there is a picture, perhaps, in the book, but there are lots of pictures from on the Library of Congress website of the Groveton Monument. It also had a tin box where they filled it with mementos. So it had a capsule, if you will, that did not happen at the Henry Hill or the first Bull Run Monument, which in some ways suggests they built the Groveton Monument first. So the significance in their minds, I wasn't able to find any evidence that said, yes, this battle was more important. But that is the one that they build first, and they have the capsule in. Around it, though, were the remains of some 1,700 Union soldiers that had been reburied, at least by the late spring, early summer of 1865. So that monument truly was a memorial to the dead. It was a headstone, if you will, to all of those soldiers. But if you were to go there today, it's right against the railroad cut, and it looks very, very similar to the one that you see at Henry House Hill.
So if that one was literally, honoring the fallen by having these men buried around it, and this idea of reunification, and these are the martyrs of this reunification. Why do you think the Henry House Hill one became larger than life out of the two? Was it because it's actually better documented? Was it something else? I mean, Gardner's not going out checking out Groveton; he's going to Henry House Hill.
Right. So twofold. One is that when they have the dedication ceremony, which is an impromptu ceremony, it happens the next day after they finish it. They decide they finished it on June 10th, and on June 11th, they say, we need to have, probably that evening of June 10th, we need to have some sort of dedication. They invite a couple of prominent figures, including people like General Heisselman to come down and be part of it. A train leaves Washington, D.C. It's right on the railroad tracks. It's so close to get to the proximity. I shouldn't say it's right on the railroad tracks, but the proximity to Henry Hill as opposed to getting over to Groveton. And so the first ceremony, the first dedication happens at Henry Hill for the first Bull Run monument. Then they have lunch. Gardner probably packs up his materials and leaves after that because there aren't the same number of pictures, or there aren't pictures of the Groveton dedication the way that there are at Bull Run. So that's part of it, I think. The other is then the proximity of the roads afterward. The Henry Hill Monument, close to what's now Sudley Road. People could come off of that, see that monument. And there was a veteran that lived there. He rented the house from the Henrys. And he charged, at least in the late 19th century, he charged a small fee for people to come and visit the monument. The one at Groveton, owned by the Dogan family, they did not charge, but to get to that monument, you had to go through fields, through fences. They had a heck of a time with people sometimes leaving their gates open. So it's off the beaten path in a way that the monument to First Bull Run was not.
I was really enthralled with the language that was used at the ceremony, because it is very much like, we know why we fought this war. We know what we were fighting against. Let it never happen again. It was not, as you said earlier, there was no reconciliation here right now. It was very much, this is our ground now, and this is why we earned this reunification, not reconciliation. That kind of language of really pointing out what the war was about in that moment. Do you think that is very important to look back upon, to say, this is what they thought it was about at that time compared to what we think sometimes we conceive it was about, or we hear it's about? This is how they thought about it.
Well, it's key if that is our goal. If our goal as historians is to understand the meaning in that moment, it doesn't mean that the meaning of a monument doesn't change over time, which I hope we'll get a chance to discuss. But if we want to understand what the initial purpose and sentiment and attachment was, and the reason for being was, then we absolutely have to look at their words. Do you mind if I read some of those stanzas from there was a hymn especially written for the dedication?
Yeah, please.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll just read 3 short stanzas. Here on Virginia's sacred soil, where slavery bred and drove the gangs, the horrid serpent lay in coil. here freedom's sons first felt her fangs. So we can see slavery is front and center here. They fought, they fell, but not in vain. Lost they the battle of Bull Run. The blows that broke the bondman's chains at last were on this ground begun. So slavery might not have ended and the war might not have ended at Bull Run, but the chain of events that would eventually break the chains of slavery started there. But this is the one that also really gets me. And so upon the bloody spot where now this monument is raised, shall rebel bones and memories rot, but patriot names for aye be praised. So there's no reconciliation there, wanting rebel bones to rot. This is still anger. This is raw. And I think we move too quickly to the notion of reconciliation. If we dwell for a little bit in that immediate, whether it's aftermath or ending of the war, we can see that there's a lot of visceral reaction. There's a lot of hatred, keeping in mind this is after Lincoln's assassination. Indeed, the minister who does what is essentially a funeral service had been one of those who had also preached at Lincoln's service.
That passage, that last passage that you mentioned, I actually have it in here, and you could tell I'm an active reader. I underline, I put, oh, this word is too bougie or something like that, but not in this book. There's been other books where I'm like, WTF in the thing, but I actually put something around it and I said, wow, and underlined it, because that was such a powerful thing for me to read, because we've taught, for years we read Hardtack and Coffee or something like that. And we hear about these jovial moments, and then we hear about the pain of battle and stuff, but we don't really hear what's in these people's hearts at that time, and even right afterwards. We tend to gloss over that sometimes. And it was such a powerful thing to read as someone who knows that one of his ancestors is still buried there at this time, somewhere on that field. That's a really powerful statement to be putting out there. But I'm sure most everyone in that crowd agreed in that moment with that kind of sentiment.
Yeah, the bitterness, the vitriol, we can't discount.
The other thing that really I underlined, and I'm like, okay, this one really hits home, is back in the first part of the chapter, where you state that memory has always been intimately entwined with contemporary politics and culture. And I put a big star and asterisk next to that and underlined it, because we still tackle this issue, and we will continue to tackle this issue, because as generation after generation comes along, they may look upon a monument differently than their great-grandparents looked upon a monument. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, Carrie, about these two monuments, but also more monumentation in general, like you speak with your students, and this kind of changing idea of what it means or what it stands for.
Right. So memory has become in vogue, I guess we can say, among scholars and now the lay public, especially since 2020 with in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the number of Confederate monuments that have fallen. And I think people are increasingly aware that memory is not static, that the way we think and feel collectively and individually about the past changes over time. But it has become ever more apparent to me that that memory is about the present, the way we talk about the past in that collective sort of way, distinguishing history from memory, but the way that we feel about the past is intimately connected to our present. And we can't separate that out from our contemporary moment, whatever the case may be. And we can look at the history of these two monuments and see that at play. And one of the ways that we see that is, they put up these stone sentinels that, granted, they're red sandstone, which is not the most permanent of structures, but these soldiers certainly expected that they would last indefinitely, last for all time. And by the middle of the summer of 1865, someone, ostensibly, most likely a Confederate or Confederate sympathizer, has taken to editing the monument by inserting Confederate over Patriot. They've probably taken a stone of some type and kind of because sandstone is quite
Mm,
soft,
right.
and kind of carved it in to the stone. And so, you know, we talk about tagging after 2020 and what happened to countless Confederate monuments across the United States. This is an early version of tagging, if
Yeah.
you will. But then the monuments get forgotten for all intents and purposes. By 1879, the one at Henry Hill is starting to tilt, it's starting to lean. Dorothea Dix, of all people, starts complaining about it to the War Department, and she wants the War Department to go look and see, what's going on. And War Department sends someone out. They send an engineer out. They have drawings that I found in the National Archives that show, in fact, the monument is kind of looking like the um, Leaning Tower of Pisa. But they're only going to put a little bit of money into shoring it up because this is not land owned by the government. Why bother? And I can get into some of the details moving forward. But long story short, by 1903, Union veterans insist that there are no monuments there. They've completely forgotten that they existed in the first place, and they push back when a local Union veteran, he's moved to Manassas after the war, and he's trying to save the monuments, if you will, and trying to get Congress to appropriate funding to protect the monuments. And really what he wants is a national park, a national military park at Bull Run. But Union veterans are saying, what monuments? They don't even exist. So the monuments themselves have been forgotten. So there's a history to this memory, but the memory and the meaning that is attached changes with every generation.
That was one thing I was really interested in too, Carrie, was the fact that they're putting these two monuments up on the old battlefields, but they haven't secured the land. And so, what does that mean for the future of this monument? I'm wondering if some of those Union veterans were like, "Well, by now that thing's probably gone," or someone probably tore it down. But just the ownership of the land itself, like who is really controlling this area that we now know as Manassas Battlefield Park?
Well, what's telling is the soldiers didn't stop to think about that or
Mhm.
get permission. They didn't go to the Dogans. They didn't go to the Henrys and say, "Do you mind if we put a monument up on your land?" They simply did it, which I think speaks volumes about what they thought they had a right to do and how strongly they felt about honoring their dead comrades. But juxtapose that to a place like Gettysburg that ends up with hundreds of monuments being dedicated in a single year by 1884, because you had the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association that is purchasing land, and that the purchasing of land in and around the Battle of Gettysburg started happening in the summer of 1863. But we're talking about battles that happened in Confederate territory where the land was not acquired by the federal government, and there's no national cemetery created there, which I also think is a key point that had not occurred to me until I started researching these two monuments. If there had been a national cemetery there, then the government would have condemned the land, and it would have afforded more protection, at least if those monuments had been within the property of a national cemetery, be it national cemeteries at Williamsburg, Winchester, Fredericksburg, Shiloh, Vicksburg. Those are government property, but the government never made an effort. And that was the whole point of this Union veteran, George Round, who becomes unhinged when he realizes that the monuments are not only falling apart, but he also I should say, to be fair, he's a local lawyer and he's representing the Henrys. And he wants the government to purchase the land. So there's a monetary interest
Mm-hmm.
that I shouldn't discount so easily. But the fact that this wasn't thought out, I think, is a good reminder to us of the way in which memory works, that we often assume that how we see things, how we interpret them, how we feel about them, either others will feel the same way or future generations will certainly understand and see it the same way. They weren't thinking long term. They were thinking, this is how we feel about our soldiers, our cause, our victory in this particular moment. Why should they have been thinking about getting title and getting deed to the land? I think it's unfair to judge those soldiers in 1865 for not doing those things. But then it plays out over almost another century, over 80 years. It's not until 1940 that the National Park Service will in fact acquire the land and the federal government will finally protect those two monuments.
How do Confederate sympathizers or descendants impact this? Or the UDC is definitely starting off in the late 1800s with their campaign. How does that play into this, since it is a Southern battlefield or it is in Southern territory? How do these organizations play into it, or try to play into it, or try to manufacture something that says a different message for the battlefield or the story in general?
So there was a ladies memorial association in the area in the 1866, 1867. They're not nearly as involved or nearly as well funded as many of the other ladies memorial associations in places like Richmond and Fredericksburg. But there are early efforts by Confederates to honor and create Confederate graves. But the UDC doesn't organize until 1894 as a national organization. And it's in 1904 that the local Daughters of the Confederacy will put up a monument that now any of those who visit, it's closer to the second Bull Run battlefield site, but you can still see that there's an obelisk put up in 1904 in the Confederate cemetery area that the LMA, that the Memorial Association had established in the 1860s, but the UDC puts up a monument in 1904. And so once they do that, now they have reason to want this land protected even more. The following year, a handful of New York regiments decide that they're going to put regimental markers at Second Bull Run. And, this has been second tier to putting a monument at Gettysburg or Antietam or any of those other places that had become national battlefield parks, national parks by the 1890s and local parks even before that. But this is the great irony of this story. It's once Confederates get involved and once Confederates have more clout in Congress, which by the 1890s, we have more veterans in Congress than at any other time in U.S. history, veterans of Union and Confederate. But by the early 1900s, it's Confederate veterans in Congress that are finally starting to push some of these bills. Nothing happens. It all, for a myriad of bureaucratic reasons and otherwise, gets shut down. But finally, in 1921, the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Sons of Confederate Veterans will come together to create the Manassas Battlefield Corporation. And this group then purchases land and they create a Confederate park. And so the great irony here is that it takes former Confederates or those promoting the Confederate memory of the war to protect the land that will eventually, under FDR, it becomes set aside as a national recreational area. And then in 1940, it finally becomes a national park. So it's, again, memory isn't a straight line. And sometimes there are odd bedfellows that come about. During the centennial or the semi-centennial, excuse me, the 50th anniversary in 1911, this is a moment when Union veterans thought, aha, we can work together with Confederate veterans and we'll get this done. And even that moment of reconciliation doesn't help them get the land protected by the federal government. It takes Confederate groups doing it within the state of Virginia that then gets turned over to the federal government. So a lot of bureaucratic weaving and woving, and it gets messy along the way.
Well, if it involves bureaucratic stuff, it usually does. It gets messy and twists and turns and red tape you weren't expecting and all that. And I'm sure the soldiers were upset about that on multiple occasions. Or like, let's just get this done.
Exactly. Yeah.
If someone was going to Manassas today to look at these monuments, what would they see, or where would they go to see these particular monuments? I mean, we know kind of where, I mean, a lot of people in here know where Henry House Hill is. A lot of people have never been to Groveton, including myself. What's it like visiting these monuments today, and what's around them?
So the Henry Hill Monument, so the first Bull Run Monument, is very close to the Visitor Center. So if you're on your way to Manassas, head to the Visitor Center. It's right outside the Visitor Center. You will see the giant, the truly larger than life Stonewall Jackson Memorial. He'll be over to your right. But if you look out toward the field from the Visitor Center, that's where you'll see the first Bull Run Monument. It's behind the Henry House. It's pretty well preserved. It has waysides, so the National Park Service signage that has pictures, that has the Alexander Gardner photographs, so you can see what the dedication looked like in 1865. To get to the Groveton Monument, if you're following the park maps, you're going to go over to the site of the unfinished railroad cut, and there's a trail that leads up to it. If you're there during the summer, hopefully the trail is mowed and it's an easy walk up. If you're there in the winter, it's certainly easy to see. Standing at the top of that slight rise just above the deep cut. So they're on they are on important parts of the battlefield. They look quite similar to what they looked like in 1865, except that there are no longer fences. The cedar fence, of course, a cedar fence doesn't exist. There were also 4 cedar trees that were planted on the corners of the Groveton Monument of that enclosure. It's now wide open. And the Groveton Monument is missing all of the projectiles that had been placed on it by the soldiers. Those were pilfered over the years.
Probably ended up in somebody's collection, or
Someone probably purchased them somewhere. Yes.
Yeah, they're in someone's collection right now. They're not realizing it's probably one of those.
Right.
Now I'm going to have to visit the Groveton the next time I go down.
And going to Deep Cut is a powerful, thinking about what Jackson's troops did there when they ran out of ammunition and they start picking up rocks and throwing them. It's not enough people go to the Second Manassas site. So I really encourage people to do so.
Yeah, my ancestor was in Duryee's brigade, so he was attacking the sunken railroad cut. So I think it'd be interesting. I don't think anyone from my family has ever gone. They just didn't get out of my area of Pennsylvania too much. So I'm the traveler. I'm going to have to go see it. But it'd be a fitting kind of tribute after reading this to go and visit Groveton, because like I said, I've never been. And every time I go to Manassas, I have car trouble. So I'm like, maybe I'm just cursed. I don't know.
Oh, that's not a good sign. Well, there's a small visitor center, a secondary visitor center that the park has over at Bronner's Farm. And so you can also go there, and there are trails that go all the way up to Deep Cut. So I'll also pitch Jim Martin's essay in our book about the 6th Wisconsin, which is part of the Iron Brigade. They fought in that vicinity right there. So that's another way that you could visit the the Groveton Monument is to go to the Park Service, the smaller visitor center, and take that short hike up.
Yeah, for everyone who's joining us, thank you again for being here this evening. The book is in the chat. The link to the book from UNC Press is in the chat. Please go pick up your copy. Mark your copy up as much as I did, so that be an active reader, everybody. Speaking of that, Carrie, I would love for you to highlight some of the other authors in here and their work, and let everyone know what they will experience when they open these pages.
Sure. So you've talked to KT. How long ago has that been now? 2 months, maybe more?
Yeah, it was like latter part of June. I had KT and Gary on at the same time.
So KT's essay looks at the logistical breakdowns in the Army of Virginia and Pope. Gary's essay looks at what this battle meant for Confederate leadership and for Lee in particular. So two great essays that pair together, as does Cecily Zander's essay, who also looks at Pope and looking at Pope as the Republican general that Republicans in Congress thought might be able to do all those things that McClellan seemed unwilling to do. But in the end, I hate to be a spoiler, but Pope was not successful at Second Manassas. And so he gets canned, gets sent back out west. And so it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or not if you can't get the job done. Jim Martin's essay talks about the 6th Wisconsin, which I should use that to say it's a nice primer into his new book that is a regimental history, and more than a regimental history of the 6th Wisconsin. It follows these soldiers from their communities to war and back home again, looking at their life as veterans afterward. Bill Marvel has a wonderful essay about Porter's court-martial, and that too, part of his larger biography that he wrote. Peter Lubke looks at Lee and how Lee's evolution, his evolution as a fighter, and some of the early battles in 1861, and how he gets from that to where he ends up in the summer of 1862 with Second Manassas. And Keith Bohannon. How can I forget Keith? Keith has a wonderful essay on Hood. These collections always have at least one biographical sketch, and he has one on John Bell Hood and what he does and doesn't do at Second Manassas.
Mm-hmm. What were your personal thoughts of Pope? I never gave him a lot of thought until this one, which may say something in itself.
So, I come away after spending so much time with people in the past, as I want to do. When I learned that he had just lost a young daughter, I forget if she was 2 or 3, just before this battle, as a parent, that changed my calculation. Now, yes, he certainly had a hot temper, and yes, he expected loyalty in a way that that maybe we're seeing a new rise in, but something that didn't translate well as a commander of an army. I don't think he was as nefarious as some people have painted him to be. I don't think his general orders that summer were as hard-handed as they were perceived. Now, I do think Confederates perceived them that way, but I don't think he was a miscreant. I don't think he was as abominable as Lee and others painted him to be.
I felt a little bad for him, not only because of that losing a child right beforehand, and how that must have impacted his mind every single day for obvious reasons, but also because he's getting 3 different forces to try to come together at one time and then figure out what to do with that.
Yes, with commanders who don't want to be subordinate. Yeah.
Yeah, commanders who think they should be in charge.
Yeah.
It sounds
Some
familiar.
things never change.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I totally understand where that's coming from. But no, I really thoroughly enjoyed this book, Carrie, because sadly I haven't read a lot about Second Manassas.
There's not a lot to
There's
read.
not a lot out there. There's been some great works in the past that have kind of stood the test of time.
Oh,
Uh,
John Hennessy's essay.
right.
How did I
Yeah.
forget John Hennessy's? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Well,
Do you want to give a shout out for John too?
well, I was going to say John's is the best and most comprehensive book on the
Right.
campaign, but the essay that he wrote for us looks at African Americans in and around Manassas and Fredericksburg, because the armies were also, you know, near and around Fredericksburg just before and during this campaign, and the way in which the presence of those armies shaped emancipation and the ways in which the enslaved population shaped the armies. So I think his essay is a fantastic example of how military history has expanded and become much more powerful because it has taken into account what's happening on the home front and the political front. That is a kind of the overarching theme throughout the essays in this book, is that we can't understand what happens on the military front without understanding the political and social and home front, and vice versa.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a fantastic read, and as I said, I've made plenty of marks, so I can't let someone borrow it because they'll be like they'll think it's just a wacky guy who's who's making notes in this book. But it's fantastic, and like I said, I have put a link in the chat for all of you to grab your copy. Please do so. And Carrie, it's been so great to have you back on and be reunited digitally with you again. It's been several years, and
Likewise.
it's so good to see you. And I'm glad you're well, and I wish you all the best for this semester. I hope the students do their homework.
They're a pretty good bunch so far. We'll see. We'll
That's
see.
good.
And likewise, same to you. Wishing you a wonderful and enjoyable, energetic semester.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm hoping that, they just make me drink more coffee.
There you
Thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. Greatly appreciate each and every one of you who has been there listening in to our chat. It's awesome to have you along for the ride. We're building a great positive community here, and I'm so happy to be a part of it. Again, thank you everyone. Have a great night. Keep reading, keep learning, and keep an open mind.